Well, good evening and welcome everyone to tonight's lecture by Ethan Katz, who will be speaking on a family affair, the untold story of the Jewish resistors who helped the Allies win World War II. I'm Daniel Schrader, the director of the Center for Jewish Studies and professor of history at the University of Minnesota. We were planning to have Professor Katz here in person and to be hosted by the Minnesota JCC at the Sabe Center. But alas, we have moved our lecture tonight online. But we greatly value the partnership with the JCC. Who has continued to be our virtual co-hosts in bringing this event to the larger public. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ben Cohen, who's the director of Jewish Arts, Culture, and Enrichment of the Minnesota Jewish Community Center. So I'm going to hand this to Ben, who'd like to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that warm introduction. I'll keep my remarks brief, and thank you, Natan and Marielle, for organizing this lecture, and to everyone joining us tonight. My name is Ben Cohen, as Daniel mentioned. I'm the new Director of Arts, Culture, and Enrichment at the Minnesota JCC. And inspired by Jewish values and culture, the Minnesota JCC aims to ignite the human spirit through programs and services that promote well-being, foster inclusivity, and strengthen the entire community. And we're very proud to be a partner with the Center of Jewish Studies to host tonight's lecture, which is as relevant to our community now as ever. Learning our history is one of the ways that we define ourselves, and Jews are frequently described as victims. No question that we've been victims, but it's important for us to study and remember our stories of resistance. Jews resisting. That's a story that we should tell more often. So I could not be more grateful to the work and to our speaker tonight, Ethan Katz. So I'll end by saying, you can learn more about the JCC's upcoming programs, including our 2022 Twin Cities Jewish Humor Fest and performances by the Minnesota JCC Symphony Orchestra. We have art exhibits, talks, and much more. We look forward to many, many more programs like this with the Center of Jewish Studies in the future, hopefully in person at the Minnesota JCC. In the meantime, please visit us at minnesotajcc.org and say hello. So thank you, Daniel and Ethan, and the Center for Jewish Studies for bringing us this lecture tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. And again, we're very grateful for this collaboration and being able to bring this to such a an interested public and to the larger community. And I also want to urge everyone to please visit our website, the Center for Jewish Studies of the University of Minnesota, and you can learn more about our upcoming community lectures and other events that the Center for Jewish Studies offers this year. I was going to say that we do hope to resume in-person events sometime this year, but we'll keep you posted in any event. And again, our regrets that it didn't begin with Ethan as planned. I also want to thank our University of Minnesota co-sponsors, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Department of History, and the Department of French and Italian. And very special thanks for the continued support of the community, and especially a very generous gift in memory of Julia Kay and Harold Segal, which has really helped us sustain this program now for quite a number of years. I am forever grateful to to our associate director of the Center for Jewish Studies, Natan Paradise, and to our outreach and program coordinator, Mario Quilter, and especially in these times with all the challenges, as you can see, that continue with with these online platforms. But especially I want to thank all of you for all the participants who are this evening present with us for this lecture. So it's now my great privilege to introduce my colleague, Ethan Katz, an associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Had he been present in person, I would have thanked him for braving the cold of coming from California, but then again, Ethan is no stranger to the frigid Midwest, having received his PhD at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He has also taught at the University of Cincinnati before moving to Berkeley, where he is now an associate professor of history. I also wanted to remark that he is also co-founder and co-director of the Berkeley Anti-Semitism Initiative, a major commitment of time, I am sure, and effort to educate colleagues, students, and the larger public on this crucial and challenging issue, especially these times. I think it's really quite a very important undertaking that Ethan is doing right now. His scholarly works are prolific and extremely influential. He's the author of many works on Jewish-Muslim relations in France, in Jews in colonial societies. He's a scholar of World War II and the Holocaust. He's co-edited several books that include Secularism in Question, Jews and Judaism in Modern Times, and Colonialism and the Jews. And I want to particularly mention his brilliant award-winning book, The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France, which has also been translated to French. Actually have it right here. Very recommended book to read. And this book and some of his other publications related to this have generated a lot of public discussion and debate in France, in the United States, in Israel, and elsewhere in other countries. A book that really challenges us to rethink many of our assumptions about Muslim-Jewish relations, and has really pushed scholarship, I think, in very new directions on this subject. Now, this evening he will talk about his new book project, equally fascinating and in some ways a little known subject. I could say a lot more about that, but we are all here to hear Ethan. And so we're really, truly grateful for the opportunity to hear Ethan talk about this untold story about Jewish resistors in Algeria during the Second World War. So I'm handing you now the virtual platform, and Ethan will let you get going with no further ado. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for that outrageously kind introduction. I'm afraid it's all downhill from there. I really appreciate the kind words and the invitation, and I am sorry that I cannot be there in person. And thanks to everyone for what is, even for a virtual event, a lot of work in organizing. And I'm also really grateful to some family and friends that I see from the participants list are out there watching. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to share my screen now to show my PowerPoint. 1 second. Okay. So in the early morning hours of November 8th, 1942, the American and British armies began Operation Torch. At that time, the largest amphibious landing in recorded human history, the invasion saw 110,000 troops and 800 warships and transports land on a score of beaches spanning more than 1,200 miles of the Atlantic and Mediterranean coastlines. You can see pictures here of the landing on our right. The key site for this campaign was North Africa, and everyone involved in the strategic planning agreed that victory ran through the rapid seizure of the city of Algiers. Until this time, North Africa was under the control of the Vichy government, France's authoritarian pro-German regime that had taken power shortly after the French surrendered to the Germans in June of 1940. Now, in October of 1940, of its own accord, without any pressure from the Germans, Vichy had abrogated the Crémieux Decree, an act that 70 years earlier had made nearly all Algerian Jews into equal French citizens. This act had been a turning point in Algerian Jewish history because it had separated Jews from their Muslim fellow natives who did not enjoy citizenship. And it had begun a process whereby Algeria's Jews gradually became deeply attached to French language and culture. Now, with the stroke of a pen, Jews were suddenly demoted to colonial subjects, holding the same status as Muslims, and further anti-Semitic measures would follow. It's well known that Operation Torch opened a crucial second front in World War II, soon chasing the Axis powers from North Africa, setting in motion the Allied liberation of Southern Europe. What is far less well known is that the Allied path into Algiers was paved by the work of an underground movement, in which a band of young Jewish idealists teamed with a group of arch-conservative military brass and businessmen. Over a period of months preceding the invasion, the resistors coordinated their efforts with the Americans, in particular with Robert Murphy, pictured here on the left, the special U.S. envoy to the region who reported directly to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In the last days before the invasion, the home of Henri Aboulker became the headquarters for the insurgency. Aboulker, who we'll return to in a few minutes, was a prominent figure in the Algerian Jewish community. He was more broadly respected as a doctor, professor, and local political leader. His son, the 22-year-old medical student José Aboulker, had been one of the earliest resistors in Algeria and would assume central importance in the insurrection. In the wee hours of November 8th, which was the designated date of the Allied landing, a rather motley group of some 400 students, shop owners, doctors, lawyers, and a handful of French military officers managed to take over nearly all of Vichy France's major institutions in Algiers and to place the regime's key leaders under house arrest. The insurrection and the landing came as a shock to the supporters of the Vichy regime, with many pro-German leaders arrested in their own headquarters or even their own bed. Some were even imprisoned in the jails that they ran. And the element of surprise was crucial. Robert Murphy later said that Operation Torch was, quote, partially a bluff. It relied upon catching the enemy off guard and giving the impression of far more overwhelming force than at that time the Allies were able to muster. The success of the underground was all the more remarkable for the numerous obstacles it faced. The insurgents were ill-equipped. They only possessed several hundred pre-World War I level rifles and tour buses provided by the Americans. In many cases, their claim to authority was thin. They had disguised themselves by wearing armbands with the initial VP, the insignia of a local volunteer militia that supported the Vichy regime. In the days before the invasion, promised arms from the Americans repeatedly failed to appear. At the appointed time on the night of November 8th, several hundred of the 800 young men who had affiliated with the insurgency movement in the preceding weeks and months failed to show up. In the midst of chaos, José Aboulker took charge as various teams of insurgents fanned out to key points throughout the city. At a series of locations, the same scene repeated itself. A small group of resistors showed up wearing the armbands of the local militia and showing orders for them to relieve the Vichy commanders. Unsuspecting, the officers on duty just turned over control of each strategic location to the members of the insurgency. But as dawn broke, there was still no sign of the Americans. They had elected to take a slow and circuitous path toward Algiers rather than the rapid one originally promised. Now Vichy had begun to fight back. Aboulker used a blend of ruse and inspiration to rally the resistors over the radio, imploring them to hold their posts for as long as possible. Eventually, before the next evening, the Allies entered Algiers and took control of the city without firing a shot. Before too long, they would control the broader Mediterranean. But the liberation of Algeria did not mean the restoration of the pre-war status quo, as a new battle began over the territory's French leadership and ideological direction. Despite their central role in the uprising, Jews did not succeed immediately in regaining their rights. For the first few months after the landing, all of the racial laws remained in place, and Jews who had lost their professional position or their property only recovered them on an individual basis. In exchange for his support of the Allies, François d'Arlon, a notorious pro-German collaborator, became military commander and civilian high commissioner for all of French North Africa. After d'Arlon's assassination in late December, several Jewish leaders of the underground, including Henri and José Aboulker, were arrested and imprisoned. It was only in March 1943 that the High Commissioner for Algeria, General Henri Giraud, announced the end of Vichy's racial laws. But at the very same moment, he also abrogated the Crémieux Decree, the Emancipation Decree of 70 years earlier, for a second time. And so it was only in October of 1943, in fact, almost a year after the landing, that Algerian Jews regained their French citizenship. Now, this took place 75 years ago, more than 75 years ago, but strikingly little is still known about the Algiers underground and its Jewish participants, and that's quite remarkable. It's a fascinating and important story, and that's why I'm currently writing a book about it. And one crucial piece of that story that I'm going to focus on tonight lies not in grand strategy or weaponry or international high politics or even the causes animating a group of ordinary people, but rather in family, and in one remarkable family in particular, the Aboulkers. The Algiers insurrection, an uprising that was only possible due to connections and coordination that crossed continents and that played a key role in one of the global turning points of World War II, was also at its heart a family affair. Absent not only José and Henri Aboulker, who I've already mentioned, but much of their extended family, which might in some ways be better understood as a clan of sorts. Without them, there would in all likelihood have been no cohesive movement on November 8th and no insurrection, let alone such a successful one. Now, it's worth beginning near the beginning, at a time when, particularly in Algeria, the resistance as we know it hardly existed. In the initial months after the fall of France in June of 1940, to think of resisting, you had to have a kind of raw and rare self-confidence, a sense of possibility and even destiny. In order to get others to follow you, you needed an atypical credibility. Two of the young men who assumed leading roles in the early months of 1941 were a pair of cousins, José and Raphaël Aboulker, and they were surely uncommon in both their guts and their reputation. Now, when France fell in 1940, José Aboulker was a 20-year-old medical student at the University of Algiers. By early 1941, he was starting to have conversations with some of his fellow medical students and other comrades about what could be done to help resist. In one such conversation in February of 1941, Aboulker's friend Joseph Serrault put the problem to him directly. He said, "Should we help the British? Yes, but how? They fight in the air. They are preparing to defend their islands. They're pushing back the Germans on the Egyptian border. Help the British? Us in Algiers? How?" José had thought a lot about it, and he had a ready answer that was bold, unprovable, and surely seemed overly optimistic. He said, quote, "The Americans will come one day to Algiers. The Vichy army will fight against them. We will help them." In hindsight, José reflected that given that the US had not even entered the war and everyone knew of the powerful streaks of pacifism and isolationism current in American politics, his response was altogether unreasonable. But America remained the great hope of many French men and women after the defeat of 1940, and José and his Algerian comrades were no different. What made José unusual was the confidence and certainty of action that he projected as he made his prophecy and called those around him to resist. At the end of September 1941, when the Vichy regime published a numerus clausus that severely limited the number of Jewish students in universities in Algeria, Aboulker participated in a meeting of students who gathered to oppose the measure. The same meeting was attended by Jean Ben Saïd, who would later take the name Jean Daniel and become an eminent journalist and philosopher in post-war France. At this meeting, Ben Saïd spoke for a moment and insisted that no matter the measures of the Vichy regime, he remained unfazed and was as French as he'd always been. The implication seemed to be that no one should overreact and the Jews should not turn inward or mobilize collectively. Immediately after that, José Aboulker rose to respond in a manner that Ben Saïd found both irritating and unforgettable. Wearing a self-assured smile and cocking his head with confidence, Aboulker acknowledged Ben Saïd's, quote, proud inspiration, but insisted that this moment was an opportunity not to be missed. A great energy was gathering and it should not be allowed to disperse. Following the meeting, Aboulker asked Ben Said if he would be ready for something important if called upon. Having secured his comrades' consent, José explained coolly that this should not be a particularly, quote, Jewish resistance in its character. Rather, Aboulker and others should act together as French patriots, not as the anti-Semites sought to define them. He said, quote, I don't like to leave the enemy the job of determining my fight or my death. They want us to die simply because we are Jews. I will die because I am anti-Nazi, as I would want it. In further conversation with Ben Said at the university bar, José shared his plan that opposition would take the form of helping the Americans to land. As the two spoke in low but heated voices, the future philosopher was incredulous and unnerved. The Americans weren't even in the war, and yet José sounded so certain of himself that they would land in Algiers of all places. Somehow Ben Said would say later, Aboulker just knew that this thing that at the time seemed so improbable would in fact happen. Yet José soon convinced many of his vision, rallying around him a cadre of resistors. In time, he would link up with those who were in touch with the Americans and would play a key role in coordinating the insurgency with the Allied landing. Among the first people with whom José had discussed his plans already in early 1941 were his cousins Raphael and Stéphane Aboulker. 36 years of age at the war's outbreak, Raphael, pictured here on the left, unlike José, came of age in the interwar years and in both mainland France and Algeria. After a stint of several years completing his medical studies in France proper, years that made him a die-hard devotee of French republicanism and culture, he returned to Algiers in 1932. By the mid to late 1930s, the growing fascist menace turned this long-standing, sort of indifferent young man about politics inside out, making him an ardent alarmist about Nazism and fascism. After he served as a French army medic in the campaign of 1940 in Tunisia, Raphael returned to Algiers in the summer of 1940, determined to continue the fight, but unsure about how to go about it. As he looked around for other nascent resistors, in late 1940, he discovered the Géographe group, an auto-defense group mostly made up of Jews, created to take on any threats of anti-Jewish violence. The group was named for Géographe, a local former boxer who gave his name to the gymnasium where its members trained. He did not know anything about the group's covert activities until really the last moment. Géographe is pictured here on the right, and the founders of the group are on the left, receiving honors after the war. When the National League Against Racism and Anti-Semitism, or the LICA, became dissolved by Vichy in autumn of 1940, Aboulker, who had recently joined the league, this is Raphael Abukail, he urged its members in scattered locations to come to the Salle Géographe. Soon the group's founders, who included Raphael's childhood friend, André Timim, asked him to become the leader of the Géographe. And not long after that, Raphael and José discussed their surprise at the limited nature of the group's mission. Under Raphael's leadership, it began to transform itself from a Jewish self-defense troop into ultimately the largest and most cohesive unit within what would become the underground of November 8th. In the months before the landing, Raphael reconnected to his pre-war acquaintance, Alfred Pillafort, a French army captain who was searching for a unit of shock troops who were well-trained and prepared to help the Allies land. In the Géographe group, more than 130 strong, Pillafort found just such a force. So what was it about José and Raphael Aboulker that gave them at once the wherewithal and the credibility to assume from such early dates these roles of major importance in what would become the Algiers insurgency? The answer in a word is family. Since the first arrival of their ancestors in Algeria from Iberia in the late Middle Ages, numerous Aboulkers had become prominent scientists and doctors, but also Kabbalists, psalmists, and rabbis. Their rabbinic pedigree included notable figures such as the famous sage Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet, who lived from 1326 to 1408 and was known as the Ribash. The religious eminence of the family was also local and enduring. As recently as the late 19th century, Samwell Abukail, who lived from 1814 to 1895, was chief rabbi of Algiers. He was a longtime respected shochet, or ritual slaughterer, and a member of the Algiers Bet Din, or rabbinic court. Late in life, he migrated to Jerusalem, where he became close friends with Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, one of the great Torah scholars of his generation and a founder of religious Zionism. In the 1890s, Samwell's nephew, Joseph, would play a key role in wresting control of the Algerian consistory, or community leadership structure, from the mainland French Jews who had dominated it since its founding. The stories of the family were legion and in many cases exhibited the Aboulker's remarkable capacity to live and thrive in two worlds, one of traditional Judaism and Jewish solidarity, the other of devoted French patriotism and secular colonial society. Esther, or Esti Sasportas, who was the great-grandmother of José Abukail, was extremely wealthy and generous. According to family lore, she had given the money needed to construct the original University of Algiers, its medical school, and the city of Algiers' first high school for girls, as well as to reconstruct decrepit synagogues. Two of José's great-grandfathers brought French schools to Oran and Algiers respectively, and provided the land for schools where Christian teachers, priests, and nuns could be educated, even sending their own children to study there as well. At the same time, they reached an understanding with the French cardinal in Algeria, Charles Lavigerie, with whom they played chess regularly, that there would be no proselytizing of Jewish pupils at the school. Lavigerie's relationship to the family also extended to his rabbinic counterpart, Samwell Abukail. In 1890, as the latter prepared to set sail for Palestine, the cardinal was among the throng that followed him to his boat. Ultimately, the family traced its greatness much further back. They firmly believed themselves to be direct descendants in multiple branches of the royal house of the biblical King David, and they possessed extensive archival files meant to prove it. Whatever the factual basis of this claim, as we shall see, it played a role in family lore well into the 1930s. Raphael and José Abukail each experienced personally the impact of their lineage. For Raphael and his brothers, the war at once unfolded in the shadow of a larger-than-life father whose sudden death was still recent and offered an opportunity for the sons to chart their own paths as resistors. Charles Aboulker, born in 1872, who died tragically in 1937 in an accident on the tramway in Algiers, was the first Algerian Jew to be head of the surgery division at the Hospital of Algiers. He volunteered as a medic during World War I and was wounded at the Battle of Verdun, and he contracted diphtheria while trying to revive a lifeless soldier on whom he had just operated by blowing his own breath into the man's infected wound. During the interwar, while continuing to practice medicine, he held major government positions as a member of the local Délégation Financière and the Conseil Supérieur, two bodies with tremendous budgetary power in Algiers, and through his repeated election as a conseiller général, or representative to the civil government, for the 3rd district of Algiers, which was the most predominantly Jewish portion of the city. Charles was a figure of enormous local popularity within and far beyond the Jewish community, who was known widely as the, quote, doctor of the poor for his generosity toward his clients of limited means. The latter sometimes dubbed him even the king of Algiers, and Muslims saw him as a marabout, or traditional healer, a mark of warm regard that reflected the respect and humility with which he treated Algeria's indigenous population. Meanwhile, though he was so much of an atheist in his religious outlook that he refused even to circumcise his sons, Charles actively supported many Jewish causes. He was an officer on the Algerian Committee of Jewish Social Studies that worked in the 1930s to defend Jews against attacks and to promote good relations with Muslims and Christians. He was president of the Algerian branch of the International League Against Anti-Semitism and Racism, and he was an active supporter of the Jewish National Fund that raised money to support Jewish settlement in Palestine. Charles' untimely death in December 1937 in a freak accident sent shockwaves through the community. At his funeral, a crowd of as many as 50,000 accompanied his coffin through the streets of the city. You see a picture of this here on the cover of the Algerian Jewish newsletter on the right. In 10 separate eulogies, representatives of the hospital government and the Jewish and Muslim communities expressed their profound anguish at his sudden passing and their appreciation for his qualities of compassion, courage, dedication, humility, wisdom, and particular concern for the least fortunate. Now, by contrast, we know little about Charles Aboulker as a father. At his funeral, for all the accolades, this part of his life was only mentioned once, when it was said that the children of the deceased were, quote, his pride, his only pride. José's sister, Colette Aboulker, 17 at his death, remembered him warmly, but recalled a conversation with another family member who claimed that Charles was effectively a genius who did not know how to talk to children. From these small snippets, we might surmise that as a parent, Charles was both devoted and somewhat distant. Regardless, it is striking the degree to which the life of Raphael, his oldest son, followed paths charted by the father. After studying medicine in mainland France, when he returned to Algiers in the early 1930s, he made his way in significant part because he was well known as his father's son. In 1938, he was elected to his father's old seat on the Conseil Général. It was as a member of the organization his father had headed locally, the LICA, that he began to gather like-minded Jews in what would become the Géoglasse group within the underground of November 8th. Raphael was asked by the group's founders to head the Géoglasse. They claimed they were searching for a, quote, personality to play this role. By this, they almost surely meant someone with local visibility, which Raphael had largely by dint of his father's fame and popularity. As a resistor in the Géoglasse group, however, Raphael would in time step out of his father's shadow, joining a cause that seemed doomed to many and placing himself at considerable risk. For José and his sister Colette, who would also play a crucial role at the heart of the movement, their father loomed equally large. Henri Aboulker was still very much alive and ultimately destined to play his own key role in the underground. Henri and Charles, whose fathers were first cousins, had much in common. A prominent doctor himself, Henri was an eminent surgeon of his generation. We can see a picture of the hospital where he worked. Also involved in local politics, Henri was the longtime head of the center-left Parti Radical in Algiers. Like Charles, he was deeply invested in a number of Jewish causes. In 1915, Henri was among the founders of the Algerian Jewish Committee of Social Studies, which had been created to oppose anti-Semitism. And in 1936, he helped to revive the same organization. During that same era, alongside his cousin, he was a leading member of the Algerian branch of the Lika and supporter of Zionism. He had participated valiantly himself as a doctor in World War I, where he was shot from his horse while inspecting the trenches. Feared dead, he survived and returned to the field of battle even, but doctors could not remove 42 pieces of shrapnel from his body, mostly in his chest, and they would remain there for the rest of his life. Now, while he was equally eminent to his famous cousin, Henri was more bourgeois. He was highly cerebral and part of the European Society of Algiers. He was less connected than Charles to the wider population. Until Vichy law stripped him of his post, he taught at the University of Algiers, whereas Charles continued to live in the old town of Algiers with much of the Jewish population of the middle and lower strata. Henri's family had migrated southwest to the Rue de Michelet in the highly affluent and Europeanized Mustafa neighborhood. The Aboulker lineage played a major role in Henri's family. His brothers even chose him to hold the family title of Nassi, or prince, in his generation, but as a socialist, he refused to accept it. Nonetheless, Henri's children were steeped in family lore and a sense of rabbinic and even royal lineage. This was particularly pronounced in the case of Colette, José's older sister, pictured here. She was a precocious free spirit, and at the age of 4, Colette decided that her true mother was her aunt Célestine, who lived in Oran rather than her native Algiers. She carefully left her house, snuck onto a train to Oran, and for more than 2 years, she mostly lived with her aunt and uncle. By then, Colette faced a major constraint on her daily life. She'd been born prematurely, with her throat not fully developed, and she therefore had irretentive vocal cords. After she strained her voice when she was 4 years old, her father, partly as a doctor, treated the problem by insisting she cover her mouth constantly with a bandage that was only removed during meals so that she could not speak. Originally intended to last for 2 weeks, this treatment went for over 3 years. Though such a period of silence and restraint was difficult, it was also the way that Colette discovered imagery, the language of the inner life, and she became an extraordinarily keen observer of human activity and emotion. Having learned to read and write at a very young age, she compensated for her inability to speak by incessantly scribbling her thoughts and observations in a notebook, which later became the basis for a 5-volume memoir that she wrote of her childhood years. Within this memoir, we can discover that as a young girl, Colette was reminded at every turn of her lineage and the responsibility that it carried. Once on the Jewish holiday of Purim, Colette's grandmother told her and her cousins as they prepared to perform a short play, quote, "You are no longer a little boy or a little girl, born in 1905, 1910, or 1912. You are a hero or a prince who helped save his country by fighting the Romans, the Greeks, the Philistines, or the Arabs. Remember and never forget that you also belong to bygone days when your ancestors lived. The people who will see you act in the play today or tomorrow will be at one and the same time now and in the past. Your acting is like a magical wand that switches time, place, and events." Soon after, Colette's grandmother instructed her and her cousins to, quote, "Imagine that you see Moses on Mount Sinai. You are the Hebrews gathered in a spiral around the mountain. With all the Hebrews of that time, you hear the word. Listen together with Moses at the same time as Moses. You are receiving the word of God, and you promise to listen with your eyes and see clearly." At the age of 5, Colette was taught that unique among the Aboulker children of her generation, she had a sign, a mole on her forehead, that she shared with notable ancestors like the Ribash and his great-grandson, Rabbi Solomon Duran, who had been a trusted counselor of the Dey of Algiers and had helped in 1541 to save the city from the allegedly invincible Spanish Armada. She understood in that moment that when she was older, she would need, quote, to save the Jewish people in danger, the country in danger, and maybe even the world in danger. Colette was selected as well for one of the Aboulker family traditions linked to the Davidic descent. In each generation, one daughter in the extended family would be anointed and receive a gold or silver crown. It's pictured here on the right. That crown today sits in the Israel Museum. José and Colette's mother, Berthe, had been chosen for this honor before her, and at the age of 6, it was Colette's turn. Her great-aunt Mathilde from her mother's side approached Colette and placed the gold chiseled Hennin crown 50 centimeters high on the young girl's head. Mathilde told her that she was the only one entitled to wear it and would now be the heir to the traditions of the Aboulker family. Henceforth, said Mathilde, she would have important duties to perform, and as was the custom, when she turned 18 and had proven herself worthy, then she would receive the crown on a permanent basis. Such a rare pedigree is fundamental to the role of the Aboulker family in the uprising. It helps to make sense of the self-confidence, even cockiness, that, as mentioned earlier, made the young Jean Ben Said bristle in his initial encounters with José Aboulker. Likewise, the family background had generated a reputation that Ben Said himself found crucially compelling. When he later described his first meeting with José, Ben Said revealed all that he already knew about him. Quote, he was one of the heirs of the dynasty of the Aboulkers, a family of Algerian Jews where everyone had been a doctor for generations and who consolidated power, science, courage, sometimes also sanctity. Our parents would recount to us often the story of Charles Aboulker, an old character full of humor, who, not content to bring to his poor patients medication that he prescribed to them himself, would also bring an envelope containing some money that he would deposit in a corner of their house. The Aboulkers formed a clan of hospital doctors, clinic heads, and professors, joined so that none would think that he should be jealous of another. They treated anti-Semites with a haughty air of ignorance. They were not waiting for someone to close doors on them. They had taken preemptive steps. In short, well beyond their own clan, this was a family with standing, what Ashkenazic Jews might call serious yichus. Such stature helps to explain the capacity of José, all of 19 years old at the war's outbreak, to rally support for what seemed to many a quixotic plan for resistance. But the importance of their family history went beyond prestige or self-confidence. In the face of Vichy anti-Semitism, José, Raphael, and their siblings actively embraced a deep sense of hereditary obligation, destiny, and self-confidence. As a young girl, Colette Aboulker had self-consciously taken to heart lessons imparted by her elders. When she visited the tomb of Rabbi Ephraim ben Israel al-Kawa, an eminent medieval ancestor whose grave had become a pilgrimage site, she thought of how he had famously tamed the lions that were threatening the local population. Quote, each of us, she told herself, knows that he will have later to confront lions and master them like the Rav. When she was 5 years old, as she sat beneath portraits of some of her famous ancestors and her grandmother's shoe and her Aunt Fortunée, and they asked her what she had learned that year, Colette knew the right response, that she had to protect her mother and her father and help them save France. The sense of being part of a unique Jewish and family destiny was palpable enough to cast a positive light even on the painful removal each night of Colette's adhesive bandage over her mouth. She did not complain. Instead, she thought about how her voice would need to be heard when it came time for her to save the Jews, connecting this in her mind to her great-grandmother Beatrice, born on the same day as Colette 400 years before. She told herself that such a role was her ultimate goal, and that the period when her mouth was closed would help to prepare her. Watching her father return to the front in World War I after being seriously wounded, she told herself, quote, saving other people is his profession and the family's calling. José, while younger, was very close to his sister and raised in the same home. From 1934 to 1936, as a 14-year-old, he was the child who accompanied his mother and father as they sought to retrace the legendary journey of family discovery of Berthe's grandmother, Esti. Decades earlier, Esti had traveled the world for 2 years in search of all the sites where her family had lived. José, more than his sister, grew up at the feet of their mother, Berthe, a talented poet, playwright, and musician who, after being kidnapped and hidden in a sack of salt at the age of 2 by a group of bandits, suffered from various ailments throughout her life. As a writer, Perhaps her most notable work was a 100-page play published in 1934, La Kahina, Reine Berbère, which is the first book published by a woman in French in Algeria. And this was a play that gave a romantic interpretation of the legendary Berber fighter queen Kahina. Benichou placed dialogue in the title character's mouth and turned her into a Jewish resistor of North Africa unwittingly avant la lettre, right? Before the time of the resistors during the war. Benichou's Kahina explained, quote, defend Ifriqiya, an ancient Berber territory in North Africa, prepare the fight. This time, they will break your resistance. Further on, she says, I am the Kahina warrior. I am the Kahina without fear. And later adds, I am a warrior and not a woman. This was all around the Aboulker children as they grew up. This was one of their mother's favorite stories. In Raphael's case, it was his own father who had provided a model and instruction for resistance. During the Dreyfus affair, while he was a medical student in his early 20s, Samwell Abukail did not flee Algiers for France like many of his classmates. Rather, he insisted on staying and led groups of Jewish young men who would patrol the streets of Algiers ready to intervene and take on anti-Semitic agitators. Sometimes they even fought duels. As for so many Dreyfusards, the battles of that era seemed to shape Charles' outlook for the remainder of his life. When he heard about the Muslim-Jewish riots in Constantine, Algeria, in August of 1934, that left 25 Jews and 3 Muslims dead, Charles went directly to Constantine to try to help. He did not like to travel by air. There was no regular airplane service between Algiers and Constantine. So what did he do? He took a postal plane and he sat amidst the bags of mail because he was confident that he would be able to establish a rapport with Muslims there to calm tensions. As he learned of the negligence of the authorities in the face of the rioters and the violence, he simply said, quote, we must consider defending ourselves. As darker clouds gathered in the coming years, this lesson remained on his mind. In April of 1936, a 24-year-old Algerian Jewish butcher boy named Leon Ben Khalifa was killed in a confrontation with the militant supporters of far-right anti-Semite Henri Coston. The Algerian settler press described this boy, Ben Khalifa, and his fellow communist aggressors as, quote, delinquents. The next day at a political meeting, Samwell Abukail stood up and defended them. He referred back to the battles of the years of the Dreyfus affair that he knew firsthand, and he declared, quote, the Israelite youth, the Jewish youth, have shown that it does not want to see itself renew the troubles of 1898, and that it does not want to live in shame. He described Ben Khalifa and his comrades as, quote, people of courage and of heart who have preferred to risk death rather than to live in shame. And given what we know about Charles, we don't need to be a thoroughgoing Freudian to imagine that when his 3 sons became wartime resistors, they must have imagined that their father would be proud. Indeed, for the Aboulkers, resistance should not be understood simply as part of the regional and global drama of World War II and the Holocaust, but also as marking a set of passages within a family drama. By 1942, both dramas were coming to a head, particularly inside the walls of the Aboulker home at 126 Rue Michelet, where Colette and José still lived with their father and mother. As Henri Aboulker witnessed a growing stream of visitors at their home who came to see José, this included French officers who he did not know as friends or acquaintances of his son, he became suspicious. He later explained, quote, what I noted especially were the long absences of my son, his mysterious meetings, his whispered chats with visitors of all ages, young people or old messieurs who had the rosette of the Legion of Honor were deferential toward this young man. His whispered chats with his sister Colette, all that tormented me. In my mailbox, I found sometimes the most incriminating of papers. While he understood that José and Colette defied or ignored the danger, as their father, he, quote, felt a responsibility. One day in February of 1942, after a curious visit from an army officer, he sat José down and asked him point blank what was going on. José was direct and honest in his response. The Americans were going to land in Algiers. He and his comrades were going to help them against the French army. Quote, there are many of us, he told his father. This man who just visited is a patriot. He just arrived in Algiers. He works with us. During the same period, José's mother had grown gravely ill. Henri asked José if he had thought of his mother, which José understood to mean, with her health already failing, how would she absorb the shock were José to be arrested? José responded that yes, he had considered it. Her illness was the reason he had not gone to Gibraltar to join the Free French. He would, he said, continue with his work. Then Henri asked his son if he needed money, but José insisted he did not need any material assistance. In August, Berthe Benichou Aboulker would perish. Soon after, José asked not for money, but for something far riskier. He wanted his father to permit the rebels to use his home as their headquarters for coordinating operations in the lead up to the Allied landing and during the invasion itself. Henri was torn. In late January, the family had lost Marielle, José's older sister. According to some accounts, after hearing her father tell her that her husband who had left would not return, she had jumped to her death from the second floor of their home. Colette adopted her children and took care of them. Henri and Berthe had lost another daughter, Solange, 20 years before at the age of 8. Henri went through great anguish as he considered the perils of each course of action. He concluded that in the end, the least dangerous path seemed to be to try to cover for José and Colette's activities with the facade of his own professional notoriety. In doing so, he thought that he could in some manner hold or protect them. Quote, "What," he later asked, "is the father who does not experience this need, even when his children have no desire to be protected?" Recounting their courageous activism, Aboulker would at the same time note, quote, "They received no outside material help, absolutely none, and they all made great personal sacrifices. Having seen all that up close, I loved them all the more. I was disgusted at the general passivity, the universal spinelessness I had seen for years, above all since the defeat. If I had died in 1940 or 1941, I would have died in despair. Having seen the work of the boys of November 8th, I was relieved I could die in peace. They furnished explosive proof that pessimism should be set aside, that there reside in our youth resources that are unexpected, immense, unlimited." Henri's feelings of anxiety and pride concern not only those within the four walls of his home, that is, his two children and his grandsons from Marielle, now adopted by Colette. A much wider set of family members had become involved in the planning of the rebellion. They included his nephews and nieces, José, Lucien, and Odette Chiche, children to his sister and brother-in-law. They had all been close with Colette since the years when she had spent much of her early childhood in Oran. In total, there were no fewer than 13 cousins who were part of the underground. Several were from the Oran branch of the family, since shortly after the armistice, Roger Carcassonne, son of Berthe's cousin Marcel Medioni, had, just like José and Raphael, been seeking to organize resistance. By early 1941, he and José discovered their similar projects and decided to coordinate efforts. They also agreed on a set of overriding principles that included a double effort in Oran and Algiers around both building shock troops and intelligence gathering. The elimination of all underground journalism and propaganda because it risked the secrecy of their plans, and respect for the autonomous character of the individual movements they had formed. In October 1941, José's first cousin, Bernard Carsonti, daughter of Berthe's sister Tita from Oran, arrived in Algiers as a refugee from Paris. José and Bernard were the same age and had known each other since the days when, as young children, they played games together in their maternal grandmother's garden in Oran. Within a few months, Bernard would also play an integral role, drawing many others into the movement, furnishing the necessary material for the underground to print false identity papers, and acting as one of the closest confidants of José throughout the planning stages for Operation Torch. In early 1942, Roger's brother Pierre Carcassonne introduced José to the Carcassonne's friend Henri d'Astier de la Vigerie, the ardent monarchist who was the leader of the so-called Committee of Five. The Committee of Five, they're pictured here with d'Astier on the left, was a group of arch-conservative French businessmen and military brass who worked closely with the Jewish resistors in the months preceding the landing. D'Astier and José Aboulker found an instant rapport and soon forged an effective and trusting working relationship in spite of their vastly divergent political views. By autumn 1942, activity at the Aboulker home had become feverish, with cousins, army officers, and many others constantly coming and going. One day, when José was ill and confined to his bed, his father found him surrounded by 30 visitors. Colette managed everything, showing people in, answering the phone, keeping the household running smoothly. Fearing that the regular housekeeper would become suspicious and endanger their plans, she sent her away on vacation. Colette, her father would later explain, was ever present, but, quote, multiplied herself in silence. Though invisible and modest, she was, quote, the vigilant soul of the house. Young men constantly arrived at the house or were sent on a mission, and Colette had to prepare them food or find them a quiet spot to rest. Under the tremendous stress of the hour, she became like a sister to many of them. In the days before the invasion, a radio was installed in the bathroom of the Aboulker home in order to keep contact with the American army as it made its way toward Algiers. Late at night on November 7th came the coded announcement over the radio. Allo Robert, Franklin arrive. Robert, or Robert, denoted U.S. Special Envoy Murphy, and Franklin was, of course, Franklin Roosevelt. In the ensuing moments and hours, the House was a central hub of the underground. The Army officers slated to coordinate resistance operations failed at the last minute to show up. And it was in this circumstance that José suddenly had to step in and direct the underground as its various units carried out their missions across the city. Several hours later, Raphael would perform his own crucial act of substitution. The Americans had taken a circuitous route, and Vichy was fighting back to regain posts it had lost. The rebels were in a bit of a panic. General Henri Giraud, meant to have already arrived in Algiers to rally fellow officers and ordinary soldiers to support the invaders, was stuck in Gibraltar arguing over chains of command. Thus, Raphael went over the radio in his stead, impersonating Giraud and announcing the American invasion and ordering French soldiers to stand down before the rebels. Many heeded his announcement, and this bought critical time for the resistors. Within a few hours, the Americans entered the city and captured it rapidly, with almost no casualties. So I'm just going to conclude. What I've tried to show here is that the resistance movement that paved the way for Operation Torch, a global turning point of World War II, has to be understood not only in historical time, but also in what one historian calls family time, particularly for one family, the Aboulkers. Many factors had prepared this family to take a leading role in the resistance. The Aboulkers' deep history in the Jewish community of Algeria, their broad connections to the Sephardic Jewish world, their immersion and rapid rise in the secular world of colonial Algerian society, and a unique sense of destiny and pedigree reflective of their material success, devotion to community, and purported rabbinic and royal lineage. In many instances, their prior relationships with various kin were also crucial. Many of the siblings and cousins who worked together in the movement had known each other since childhood. They began from a sense of familiarity and trust that are crucial to all covert endeavors. In short, from the perspectives of the long and the short term, vis-a-vis the dead and the living, the Aboulkers experienced the resistance as a family drama. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the fascinating talk, Ethan. I want to remind everyone, please post and send your questions, if you will, by way of Q&A, which you should find on the tab at the bottom of your screen. That way we can be going to one place to look at the questions, rather than going back and forth between chat and Q&A. So I forgot to mention that. So please post your questions. So far, we do have a comment and question from Omar Boom, a colleague of yours at the University of California, who says that, Ethan, this is a great project. I cannot wait to see it in print. And thank you for the fascinating information about Aboulker. Well, the Lika was closed by the time this uprising of November 8th took place, and its leaders, Lakash, were interned in Jaffa and Jenin Burezg. These were internment camps in North Africa. Would you say that the Aboulker family had formal or informal contact with Lakash? He was the leader of this group, and other Muslim leaders sympathetic to Jews while in internment. So
it's a great question, and hi, Omar. Thank you so much for watching the talk. So, I mean, I would love to learn that they did. There's no indication that I've seen that Lakash was in touch with them, although, it's just hard. It's a little hard to know. And you're more of an expert than me on the Lika in North Africa in the late 30s. So I would be curious to hear more about Lakash's, what kinds of relationships he really forged there, because it seems as though, it's clear. I mean, I found maybe 36 people from the Lika who were in the movement. So it was really a wellspring for a lot of core activists in the movement, but it's just not clear how much they would have had contact beyond that local context with each other. In terms of Muslims, right, so the most prominent Muslim participant in the movement, and I have a whole chapter sort of center on him in the book, a man named Mohammed Abdel Aziz Kassus. He was a very important local leader in the Lika. I think he was vice president of the Oran chapter in the late 30s and very involved in Muslim-Jewish dialogue efforts. And I do think that his participation in the movement, which is still somewhat obscure. He's on different lists. He's referred to different places, but we don't actually know what he did. But his participation, whatever its nature was I think an extension of that work from before the war. And I'm sure he also had contacts with Lakash, but I don't know whether he did during the war.
Right. Well, there are a few questions about Abouker's family. So I'll kind of put this together, and I'm going to join it with a question of my own, which I'm curious about, and I'm sure this would be of interest to many here. One is the question: are there any Aboulker family descendants still around? From Joe Lane, and a question from our colleague. Natalie Belsky, thanking you for the wonderful talk, and was wondering if you could speak on the fate of the family after the war. And so sort of joining to that question, and also maybe a comment as well, given the fact that this was such a momentous event, the first landing of the Americans, with the Allies, but especially with the American forces in the war and the war theater that then begins in the Mediterranean. So really, even before the European theater of war opens up, and it looms, as an event, it looms very large, I think, in sort of the American psyches about the war and, teaching about World War II. It's often, that this is, sort of the battles that the Americans fought in North Africa that captures so much attention. I'm also wondering about sort of the aftermath of this family, why maybe is there such silence over, what was really an extremely important event? And then following Natalie's question also, then, what did become of the family? Did they, after the landing, do they have sort of a connection to, let's say, the Allies or the Americans, or did it just sort of dissipate from view? So anyway, really fascinating talk, and I'm just, it piques my curiosity as well as these other questions about the family.
Yeah, well, these are all good questions. So, I mean, what we know during the war itself, I mean, I mentioned very briefly that right after the Allies land, after the assassination of François Darlan, there's a whole series of arrests, and a number of Aboulkers are arrested and they're in prison even for a couple of months. Well, I didn't have time to talk about it here, but I talk about it in the book. You've heard me talk about it before, Dangle, that there's a whole kind of agreement that's reached between the very conservative forces and the forces that are led by the Aboulkers and others, that they will not have politics foregrounded at all in their movement because they have such sharp disagreements, and that once they've achieved their common goal, they can go their separate ways politically. And that's very much what happens, right? I mean, right away, you have some of the Committee of Five who join this very right-wing government, and even someone like Jean Rigaud, who's actually involved in arresting some members of the underground. And so there's a brief moment there where, they really suffer. Once they come out of prison, they're quite involved in what is a really significant and interesting internal debate within the Jewish community that's already emerged in the weeks after November 8th about whether or not Jews should be pushing to regain just their own citizenship, or they should be pushing for rights for Muslims as well. Because Jews are surprised that they don't regain immediately their citizenship, but once they realize that that's happening, many of them had been in the same kinds of circles that Omar referred to in his question about the Lika, these liberal alliances that had been arguing for reform for greater rights for Muslims in Algeria in the 30s. Many of them had been in these circles for years, and they're really pushed by a lot of their Muslim allies who say, now you know what it's like. You've lost your citizenship. You can't just fight for yourselves. You have to fight for everyone. And Henri Aboulker and Raphael Abukail, they both are involved in these different meetings. And Henri sort of leads a kind of middle way position where he says, we should fight for ourselves first. And then once we regain our citizenship, we can fight for our Muslim allies. That's the position that basically wins out. What's really interesting about both Henri and José is that in 1945, in May, when there is effectively a massacre in a couple of towns in eastern Algeria, Sétif and Guelma, to try to put down what's perceived as an insurrection, probably was not an insurrection, a massacre of Muslims in the aftermath of a demonstration, they are very involved in calling for amnesty for the demonstrators. And José actually goes himself to Sétif as a member of the kind of provisional assembly, legislative assembly in Algeria at the time. He goes to Sétif, he does his own investigation, and he makes a speech really denouncing the French actions there. So they're both quite liberal in their politics, and José will be an active supporter of independence eventually during the French-Algerian War later. And his sister Colette is also a really fascinating figure. She wrote this long memoir, which has tons of kind of imagery and imagination in it, because she became, after the war, she made Aliyah to Israel in the 40s or 50s. I'm forgetting exactly when. And she became a very prominent therapist and had a whole method for curing cancer through psychological treatment. And so she wrote a great deal about that. And in some manner, there's a connection between her sense of autobiography and spirituality and that work that she did. And she, I think, only died about 10 years ago. So, and there's another one of the, one of her sons, Yves Maxime Danon, he has written a fair amount, and he published a memoir very recently of his experiences during the war. So there are these descendants. José Aboukail also eventually worked for years and years, and he wrote a book much later about his experiences. But why the story isn't better known? I think, first of all, there are these splits between the more established people who are in it and the Jewish resistors. And so after the war, when Henri Dastier de la Vigerie is asked about all these Jewish resistors, he says, well, they weren't part of the movement of November 8th. Despite the fact that he and José had a warm relationship, each of them writes pretty harshly about a lot of the other people who participate on the other side of the movement. And so there was kind of an effort to suppress that memory in more official communications after the war. But it's also, I think, the case that it didn't fit within the narrative frames that emerge after the war in terms of what people understood, right? I mean, it was a group of Jewish resistors. First of all, they had to fight against the Vichy government, right? So it highlights the divisions within France. And many people feel it was an embarrassment for France that this kind of small group of ruffians basically defeats the Vichy army, even if it's briefly when the Americans are landing. But I think more basically, it was this weird alliance, right? It's an alliance that shows you had people who were in many ways supportive of a lot of Vichy social policy who were allied with resistors. And we had a very kind of dichotomous framework, which in many ways still endures, where you were either a good resistor or you were an evil collaborator. And this movement doesn't fit neatly in that way. And so I think that's one of the reasons. And then in Israel, where there now has been something of a resurrection of the memory of it, there was no sense of a real war in North Africa for a very long time. And now, more recently, the efforts to resurrect this memory have been very nakedly political in a way that has even been satirized by some Israeli comics. So, there's a lot of sort of larger conversations about memory, which have either ignored this or kind of tried to instrumentalize it. And I think that those are reasons why it hasn't gotten more attention.
Right. Well, I think we have time for two more questions. Both of these are really interesting and I think very broad. So I'll urge you maybe to respond to a part of them or to put them together because they're very interesting and important questions. One from Theodore Kleiman. Any thoughts about the family's ability to avoid the Vichy sweeps? What were the German plans for the Jews of North Africa? Were many Jews sent to European concentration camps? And the second question, how did the Algerian Jewish community relate to its position as beneficiaries of colonialism while also being targeted by anti-Semitism? Were they allied with the indigenous North Africans in their colonial struggle against the French? Question from Sandy Gerber. So I'll hand this to you.
Okay. Right. So I will try to be brief because I know we're near the end of our time, and there's a lot there that could be said. So there aren't really Vichy sweeps in North Africa in the way that there are in the mainland. There's a lot of things that are worse in Algeria than actually in the mainland in the first 2 years of the war, in the sense that Jews all lose their French citizenship in October of 1940. There's no law like that en masse in the mainland. And most Jews have been eliminated from public schools in Algeria by late 1941. But there are not mass arrests. There are several thousand Jews who are sent to various camps, but it's usually political prisoners. And then there are special camps for Algerian Jewish soldiers after the campaign of 1940. So that wasn't really an issue for them per se. What were the Germans' plans for North Africa? Well, there is some evidence that the Germans were going to accelerate anti-Semitic measures significantly in the period around the time of the landing. And there had already been a Jewish census in Algeria, similar to the one in France, that was going to potentially create the groundwork for mass arrests. The question about Jews being sent to European concentration camps, a tiny, tiny number of North African Jews are actually sent to Europe. But we think that roughly maybe 5,000 Jews in North Africa were in camps. There were a huge number of camps, though. I mean, there were over 100 labor camps in North Africa, but many of them were very small, and they were focused significantly on political prisoners and not in a mass way on Jews, although Jews were often singled out for harsher treatment at the camps. The question about the Algerian Jewish community relating to its position as beneficiaries while also fighting anti-Semitism is a great question. I started to get at that question a little bit a few minutes ago when I talked about the aftermath and the internal debate in the Jewish community, right? Because there is a moment, I think, of consciousness taking. It's not a totally new thing, but I think it's brought to their attention in a way they cannot avoid after the landing because they don't have their citizenship back and they're being pushed hard by Muslim allies to do more than just fight for the restoration of their own citizenship. And so then you have these very sharp internal debates, and you have Jews who say things like, now we can't, just fight for our own citizenship. You have Muslims who say, basically you didn't do very much for us in the 30s when you wanted us to support you fighting anti-Semitism, and you can't do that anymore. So there is a sense in which Jews are forced to come to grips with the fact that they have enjoyed a certain kind of colonial privilege as citizens at the expense of their fellow natives, and they're really they're confronted with that question, and they have to debate it internally, even though their answers are quite wide-ranging, and some of them are very self-interested, and others have much more consciousness about the kind of the wider impact of their position.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you so much, Ethan, and thank you all for attending this evening's lecture. I want to encourage everyone who I'm sure you all have many more questions about this fascinating story. And so hopefully in the not too distant future, the book will be out and we'll all have a chance to read more about this fascinating story and history, which is really just so revealing about so many aspects of Jewish history during the war, about the history of the war itself, about resistance and colonialism, and so many, I think, sometimes neglected topics in understanding the Second World War and the question of resistance. So thank you again, Ethan, and everyone. And yeah, have a good evening.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for tuning in.